And this again, just to reiterate, carbohydrate is this main fuel source that we use for sport. The reason I showed that information at the start with the heart rate is because when we work in that area, that threshold of intensity, then generally speaking, carbohydrate is the major fuel source, and that's why we tend to focus on carbohydrate intake with athletes in and around games and training. So, how do we get this? How do we increase these muscle fuel stores? Very simply, we consume a fairly large amount of carbohydrate on a daily basis, but particularly what's important is the amount of carbohydrate that you consume on the days leading up to a game, particularly the 48 hours before a game and also the pre-match meal. So how is this relevant to Gaelic Games? I mean, can it actually affect performance? Well, the truth is that we don't actually have the information for Gaelic Games players, but the next best thing we can use is probably soccer. So if you look at players who just consume a normal diet and you measure how much distance they cover in a game, somewhere in the region of 9,000 kilometers, 9,000 meters, sorry, 9,000 kilometers. So if you look then at someone who's, this CHO stands for carbohydrate, so if you do what we call a carbohydrate loading regime, which is basically to increase the amount of carbohydrate that you eat in the 2 days leading up to a game, what they actually do, they'll end up covering somewhere in the region of 11,000 meters. So that's about a 2,000 meter improvement in terms of the distance covered just by changing the type of foods that you eat in the 48 hours leading up to the game. So we've no reason not to believe that this isn't the case for Gaelic footballers or Gaelic Games players in general. And so, broadly speaking, the recommendations are to consume a high carbohydrate diet in the 48 hours leading up to a game. Now, the interesting thing about this extra distance covered, and going back to the point that I was trying to make at the start, is that it's not just that the distance covered is greater. That's just one thing, but it's an increase in the amount of distance covered in the second half, and also the overall number and percentage of time spent sprinting. So they're performing better in the second half, and they're performing at a higher intensity in the second half. And I think everyone will agree that if you can get players to do that, then you're really going to improve your chances of winning games. Okay, so that would be specifically to do performance. Just one other thing about carbohydrate and about training in particular now. So if we were to imagine that you had groups of players and they started off the week with a full tank of fuel ready to go, and they trained on consecutive days. So this is 3 different training sessions over consecutive days. What happens with the body's fuel stores is that every time you train, you take something out of those fuel stores. So you deplete them, as we say in scientific terms. The idea is that if you consume a diet that's nutrient rich, so if you've got the right foods in there, that you tend to recover these stores within 24 hours. However, if the diet is inadequate, so if someone is not eating the right types of food, you tend to see that you only make this marginal increase in terms of refueling, so filling up the tank again. Now, if you extend this out over 72 hours, so 3 days of training, so imagine you're training on a Thursday, Friday, and Saturday leading up to a game, or Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. The person who's consumed the right diet with the right nutrients is kind of roundabout back up to a full fuel tank. The person who's consumed the inadequate diet is pretty much running on empty by the end of that intense 3-day training program. And now if you remember what I showed on the previous slide where I said that the amount of fuel in the muscle determines your performance, it's clear that this person is going to perform a lot better than this person when it comes to the day of a match. So these are things that are important to consider in terms of nutrition and performance. Now, just to say a bit about carbohydrate, most people will be aware, I think, that you've got what are considered starchy carbohydrates and what are considered simple and sugary carbohydrates. So these are just some examples of the 2 different types and some images to show you those. Now, what's kind of going to happen is that players are told, carbohydrate's important, try and eat as much carbohydrate in the lead up to the game, and it's sort of given as just eat anything. But that, I'm just going to say, it's not really as simple as that, and I don't think players should be just told to eat everything that they see. So I think we need to be a bit more careful in terms of what we recommend athletes to eat, because there are definitely some what we would call good carbohydrate sources, and there's a lot of others that would be considered bad, which athletes are more likely to consume, funnily enough. So if we were to look at, for example, breakfast, I mean, a good carbohydrate source would be something like porridge. A bad source might be this sugar-sweetened cereal. So this is like mini chocolate biscuits dissolved in milk, so probably not a good carbohydrate source, even though you'll be led to believe all cereals are good. Fresh fruit, obviously, is a good thing. This kind of fruit-based soft drink idea where it says, this is fruit juice and fruit juice contains, whatever, 1% fruit juice. These are probably bad carbohydrate sources. A sweet potato is a good source of carbohydrate. A potato crisp is also a source of carbohydrate, but not a very good source. Multi-seed bread is obviously better than white bread. And something like brown or wild rice is certainly a lot better than something like instant noodles. So if you give a player, or if a nutritionist comes in and gives your players goals for carbohydrate intake that are just based on grams or energy and don't necessarily give them good direction on the types of carbohydrates, then you're potentially going to be consuming a lot of very bad foods over the course of a very, hopefully, long career for most players. So it's just something I wanted to emphasize about. Players they are sensitive to good and bad food as well. Okay. Just the other thing that I mentioned in terms of things that affect fatigue was hydration. And so just to make one sort of statement here, the simple truth is that no other nutritional intervention comes close to providing the performance-enhancing effects of staying well hydrated. So hydration, hugely important for performance. Very simple graph, again, to summarize a lot of research done over the last sort of 20 years. And that's basically that as you become dehydrated, you get this decline in performance. And so for a 13-stone player, if we're looking at, say, 2% dehydration, a 13-stone player, which is roughly my size, you're talking about losing 2 to 3 pounds through sweat. And there's been a couple of different studies that have looked at sweat rates in the GAA, and often we're seeing greater than 2 pounds of sweat loss per hour. So if you extend that over a long training session or over a warm-up and game, you begin to realize that GAA players do lose a lot of water through sweating. Now, this assumes that they turn up at the game perfectly hydrated. If they turn up to the game already dehydrated, then these type of sweat rates are really going to make things worse very quickly. So there's a very simple thing that we can do when we have with players, and I'll come back to this at the end again as something you can recommend to your players. But there's 3 simple questions we can ask. Players can get a weigh-in scales and they can weigh themselves every morning. If there's a very big difference between their morning weight compared to the previous morning, then there's a likely chance that they're dehydrated. If their urine is also dark, so you've got weight and urine color change, then it's highly likely that they're dehydrated. And if they're also thirsty, then it's very, very likely that they're dehydrated. So there's those 3 questions that players can ask themselves to monitor hydration. Now, the other thing that we can do is look at the P chart, and I'll just show a slide on that in a second. But I think most people will be familiar with this. The idea that if your urine is straw-coloured, then you're hydrated. If it's kind of this darker colour, then you're slightly dehydrated. And if you're down in this region, then you should probably be going to a hospital, not playing a game of football. Now, what a coach can potentially do, and this is something very, very simple that you could implement even tomorrow if you can find these tubes to buy. This is to get players to provide a urine sample in these little tubes. And if you hold those tubes up to a whiteboard, you can essentially compare them to this chart and determine if your players are dehydrated or not. So in this situation here, you can see that there's a couple of players that stand out as being dehydrated. Probably this guy, potentially him, maybe this guy, and also this person is particularly bad. Even though they were able to fill the tube, they're kind of dehydrated at the time. Now, just to note one thing, it's probably, I'm not wondering if it's coming up clear on your screen. Most of these people are actually hydrated, apart from the ones that I pointed out. And this was prior to a field-based session. This is just a smaller number of people prior to a gym-based session. And this is something you're going to see probably with your players. There's more, it's really only this guy, and these 2 here that are actually hydrated in this case. So players take their hydration a lot more serious when it comes to a field-based session, but they assume that a gym-based session, I'm going to go in, I'm not going to sweat much. That's true. They're probably not going to sweat as much, depending on the environment in the gym. But by arriving at the gym dehydrated, it's really bad practice, to be honest. Now, this candidate over here. Does anyone want to guess what was going on here? Drink, someone said. There is a problem with urine, with monitoring hydration colour. This is someone who had taken Baraka that day. So Baraka is very high in B vitamins, and B vitamins have the effect of colouring the urine a very dark orange colour. So when there's a couple of other devices that you can use to test hydration other than just colour. They're handheld devices where you can get a measurement of something called osmolality or urine-specific gravity. And in both cases, this person was actually hydrated, but because they had taken Baraka, it was showing up in terms of the colour scheme as being dehydrated. So that's just something to be aware of when you're monitoring hydration status. Okay, so just in terms of the levels of nutritional support, so this kind of goes back to the idea of whether you're a coach at a very, very basic level, whether you're working with underage teams, or whether you're working with more elite teams. There's different levels of nutrition support that you can put in place. So there's some things that I would call easy to implement, and these are what acute sort of things that you can deal with. So by acute, I mean things that can be done on the day of a game or the day before a game, and are relatively easily to change in terms of players' habits. So these can be things like just their hydration status, their pre-competition meal, whether we do this carbohydrate loading in the 48 hours before a game, some supplement. I won't get into the supplementation, but there are certain players that will like supplements for performance, and also then just having something in place to kickstart the recovery process after training session. The things that as coaches I wouldn't recommend that you get involved in, and I would leave this up to the experts, would be things like looking at things like their diet in terms of energy balance, whether they want to bring about weight or body composition changes, whether there's certain training goals that they have that need to be addressed with nutrition, whether there are some illnesses that they seem to be susceptible to, or whether there's any nutrient deficiencies. So these are things that are longer term goals that players need to be worked with on a much longer term basis. But these are potentially things that can be influenced very quickly. The other thing I just say is that the more and more that you go into this longer term realm, these things are much more difficult to and much more complex to implement, and that's why I say that you should probably leave that to the experts. I'll skip over that just in the interest of time. So there's a nutritional cycle that we can talk about in terms of sports nutrition for all players and all athletes, no matter what the sport. There's the pre-match or pre-competition meal. Then there's the fuel supply that you give them during exercise. There's the nutrition that you provide in the immediate recovery period. And we're talking about generally about 2 hours here. And then there's just your daily food intake. So what happens on a sort of 24-hour cycle. And what this arrow is really representing is that your daily food intake really accounts for the majority of that time, but also that it just feeds into a constant cycle of this can be pre-match or pre-training, fuel during matches or training, and then the nutrition during recovery. And it's a constant cycle for most players. So we call it the preparation phase, the performance phase, the first phase of recovery, and the second phase of recovery. I'm going to come back to the importance of the first phase of recovery in a couple of minutes. So this would be a sample training cycle for the modern inter-county player. So you're looking at a match on a Sunday, probably a gym session on a Monday, field training on a Tuesday, back in the gym on a Wednesday, probably in the morning, 12 hours recovery, day off recovery on your Thursday, potentially training on the field on a Friday night, optional gym session on a Saturday morning, and then you're back into your game on a Sunday. And that's kind of the way things have gone in terms of certainly the early season games. So under each one of those, different matches or training sessions, there's different demands. So in the case of a match, you're looking at 60 to 70 minutes in a warm-up. In the case of a training session, you're thinking about, is it a pre-match one where it's light, or is it just a regular training session? Is it a pre-season training session? Is it on the gym? Is it in the field? There's different demands in terms of hydration, different demands in terms of recovery. So I guess what I'm getting at here is that you can't just have a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to nutrition. It has to be tailored for different goals, different players, different cycles within different weeks. So there's, as I said, a constant cycle of training, playing, and recovering. That's the way the modern game has gone. So in terms of, I mentioned earlier that there may be certain things that we can do to enhance the response to training, and this is a slide that I show quite a bit. So if anyone has seen me show this before, don't shout anything out. We have a sports continuum and Gaelic Games is one of these sports that kind of falls in the middle here. So if we look at whether a sport is aerobic or strength-based, if we look at the duration of performance as being in seconds, minutes, or hours, we can kind of put any sport somewhere in that continuum. And Gaelic Games probably falls in around here. You know, duration is up towards more than an hour anyway, and the contribution of aerobic and strength is kind of mixed, pretty similar to these other team sports, so falling into the mixed sports category. As a result, it means that you have to train for different features of performance. So you have to train your aerobic system, you have to improve your strength, consequently you can improve your power. So lots of different things that are taken into account when it comes to training. The thing I think that certain players lose sight of, and this is what I would encourage you to emphasize as coaches, is that training in terms of your overall week or your day can be somewhere between 5 and 10%. So 5% obviously being around of 24, being somewhere around just a little over an hour and a half. Some players will obviously train up over 2 hours a day in certain cases. Sleep accounts for about 30% of that, assuming you get your 8 hours. The rest of the time is what I would call active recovery. So this is when you should be resting, and also it's when your nutrition is at its most important. So the recovery from training and the preparation for the next training session, hugely important, and also the quality of sleep. So this is counting for about 90 to 95% of your time. Training just provides the stimulus for development. It's what you do in this other period of time that actually determines the nature of that training adaptation. So just to very simply put something, depending on the nutrients that you take in before, during and after games and training, it can dramatically influence how you recover from that training session and how you adapt to that training session. So not simply about what you eat, but also when you eat. And this is a concept that's known as nutrient timing. And it's kind of, as I said when I showed the carbohydrate slide, I said this is 40 years of research. Not a huge amount has changed there, whereas this nutrient timing idea is something that's kind of developed within the last 10 to 15 years. So it really is based on something known as this post-exercise window of opportunity. And what this really says is that in the hour or so, or the hour or two after exercise, there's this change that occurs in the body in response to a training session or to a match. And what it says is that there's, in terms of the potential for growth and recovery, that this is hugely increased. So you've got this opportunity where if you provide the right nutrients to your player, that effectively that their potential to grow muscle or to recover from the training bout is actually very, very high. So the timing of the nutrition and choosing what food to eat is absolutely critical within this time point. After about 2 hours, it heads back towards baseline. That doesn't mean that what you do after 2 hours isn't important. It just means that within this 2 hour window initially, that's probably the most important time period when it comes to recovery and adaptation. So I'll just show one piece of data, so some scientific research here. There was a study that was done that essentially looked at 10 weeks of supervised resistance training. So imagine this is your players who are doing 10 weeks of pre-season training. So they're doing a supervised gym program, and basically they had everyone doing the exact same training program, and they're eating the exact same food. The only difference that they had is that they had one group who were careful about the food, the timing of the food that they ate before and immediately after their gym training, whereas the other group just ate food at random intervals throughout the day. So less concerned about the timing of their meals. And this is what happened in response to training. So if we look at group 1, which is the group that were very careful about timing at pre and post training, the other group were the random group, group 2. So you can see in the red group that in terms of muscle mass after 10 weeks, the change was about twice as much in the group that were very careful about the nutrients they took in before and after training. If you look at percentage body fat, it actually decreased by a greater amount in the same group. So if you remember what I said earlier, a lot of players are concerned now with increasing their muscle mass, decreasing their body fat, then obviously the type of nutrition that you're consuming is going to be very important around those training sessions. The other thing, which is, as coaches, you might be a little more interested in, is what happened in terms of strength. So obviously the blue group, everyone gained something from the training study. So this is in terms of the bench press or in terms of the squat, the amount of extra weight they could lift after 10 weeks. But the point is that in the group that were very careful, again, about their nutrition pre and post training, the change that was made was greater than the group who took it in random intervals. Again, the point being here that in terms of maximising the gains that you get from training, very specific strategies that you use for nutrition can have a fairly large effect on those gains. So just for the last 10 minutes or so, I just want to say a bit about what you can potentially do as a coach in terms of practical strategy. So I'm not going to go through this. I just want to say that developing a nutrition strategy is actually a complicated process. So this is just a slide that I've put together, a kind of a flow chart, just to help in terms of choosing the different strategies that need to be done, the different questions that need to be asked.